So if you guys recall, I mentioned that factoring is just like the working out part, right? It's not really the goal of mathematics just to factor. We're going to use factoring for some reason. So what we're using factoring for is to solve quadratic equations. So this is a new word, quadratic equations. Now, what in the world is a quadratic equation? So thus far, we've worked with linear equations. So when we solved linear equations, we've solved things such as 3x plus 4 is equal to 7 or something like that. We solved this in the beginning of this semester. And notice that the highest exponent is the number 1. Whenever you're dealing with a linear equation, and a linear equation is something we draw, it becomes a line, the highest exponent is just 1. And it just looks like a line if you were to draw it. So that's a linear equation. But now, if you remember, I mentioned that this is now where we go into two roads, right? Those who know how to factor and those who don't. And the reason why it's a second road now is because now we solve quadratic equations. And quadratic equations are very different from linear equations. Quadratic equations are these here. And notice when you look at these, what's the highest exponent? 2, right? The highest exponent is always 2. So when the highest exponent is 2, that's how you know it's a quadratic equation. And when it's a quadratic equation, then you're going to solve it a totally separate way from how you solve these. And actually, when you draw a quadratic equation, it's going to look like a parabola. And we're going to talk about graphing it in another chapter. But when you graph these, it's a parabola instead of a straight line. So how do you solve quadratic equations? One of those key things is to factor. So that's why it's really important to know how to factor in order to solve quadratic equations. So here, if you look at this, I have this thing that says steps for solving quadratic equations. And there are 4 steps, right? So let's talk about those 4 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right. And here we are. Yay, right? So the first step is, where's my black marker? Okay, this is it. All right, so here it is. So the first step is going to be to rearrange so that the quadratic, so it says rearrange so that the quadratic is equal to 0. So rearrange so that, or I could just say the equation is equal to 0, right? So I'm writing it in shorthand, but you could write that down as step 1 here. Rearrange so that the equation is equal to 0. Notice in number 21, it's already equal to 0. Woohoo! Easy peasy. 23, it's not equal to 0 yet, so we need to rewrite it so that it equals to 0. So when I rewrite this, I have 4v squared, and I'm going to add the v to the other side. So I'm going to bring the v over there. So if I bring the v over, I get plus v is equal to 0. So now it equals to 0, right? Which is great. However, notice that this is not in standard form. You want to write it so that it's from the highest exponent to lowest. So when I write it from highest exponent to lowest, I have 4v squared. The plus v, I'm going to make that a plus v on here, and then minus 3 is equal to 0. So that is step 1. Step 1 is to rewrite it in so that the equation is equal to 0. And I should put standard form. So I talked about standard form in the previous video. So standard form is from the highest exponent, lowest. So now this is already equal to 0, so all good in the hood. And I'll talk about number 24 later because I don't have space. Okay, step 2 is to blank using the above steps for factoring polynomials. So step 2 here is a big F word, the other one. Factor. So factor this using the steps that we did above. So here, 3y squared minus 21y, to factor, well, I'm going to first find out the GCF, right? So I'm going to find out the GCF, 3y squared and negative 21y. The GCF is 3y. So I'm going to go a little bit faster than the other videos, so assuming that at this point you guys kind of know how to do this part already. So 3y squared, 3y is a GCF. So here, there's two terms, so blank minus blank. What goes in those blanks? Well, 3y times what will give you 3y squared? Y. 3y times what will give you 21y? 7. And I always double check at this point, 3y times y is 3y squared. 3y times negative 7 is negative 21y. So I always double check. So factoring. Number 23, I also factor. But to factor, first I find out, is this a GCF? Is there a GCF? And the answer is no. Well, how many terms are there? 3. Well, if there's 3 terms, what do I do? Well, if there's 3 terms, what I do is I am going to Xbox. Yes, Xbox. So I'm going to say, what 2 things multiply to give me 4v squared? So let's say 4v and v. What 2 things multiplies to give me a 3? Again, I'm going to ignore the negative. What 2 things give me a 3? Say a 3 and a 1. So I've done this so many times that I kind of know ahead which one are the right numbers. So for the sake of time, choosing the right numbers. But if you choose 1 and 3 or you switch it around, it'll take you more chances to do it. So here I'm going to X. So when I X, I get 4v and 3v. And then I ask myself, how can I get a 1v out of 4v and 3v? Easy. I'm going to subtract the 3v. If I subtract the 3v, then I will get a 1v, which is what I want. Well, to have a negative 3v, I'm going to have a negative right here. So 4v times 1 is 4v. V times negative 3 gives me negative 3v. And that's exactly what I want because I see that there's a negative 3 here. I knew that there was going to be a negative either in the first one or the second one. The question is which one? And it was this one. So a negative 3 times 1 gives me a negative 3v. So a negative 3. So these are my winner, winner, chicken dinner answers. So I'm going to box it. And when I box it, I end up getting, so here I'm going to erase this just for the sake of space. I end up getting 4v minus 3 times v plus 1 is equal to 0. Okay. So as you can see, step 2 can either be really fast or step 2 could be really long, depending on what you have to factor. So everything you've been learning about factoring comes into play here. So what do we do after that? Okay, sorry, my knees are hurting. I'm on the tile right now. Okay, so then the third step after you do that, so remember when you solve an equation, the goal is to find out what y equals to. The goal is to find out what v equals to, right? You want to solve it. You want to find out what v equals to and what y equals to. So step 3 here says apply the blank. So apply the blank. So step 3 is the zero product property. And I, in short, again, because I'm kind of cheesy like that, I call it the ZPP, yeah, you know me. If anyone remembers that song from way back then. The ZPP, it's called the OPP, yeah, you know me. So this is called zero product property. So the zero product property, what the zero product property says, so I'm going to erase. Okay, now I lost my eraser. Let me grab my napkin. And napkins are so precious right now, so I have to reuse it. So here, I'm going to erase this part. So I'm not using toilet paper, right? All right. So what the zero product property says, so the ZPP, this one's out of marker. The ZPP, zero product property, it says what it does. So zero product property, if I gave you A times B is equal to 0, right? If I give you A times B equals 0, that's a product property, and it equals to 0. What you can conclude is that either A must equal to 0 or B must equal to 0, right? A must equal to 0 or B must equal to 0, right? So the zero product property says if you multiply, if you have a product of 2 or more things and it equals to 0, that means that one of the factors, ding, 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 the word factors, one of the factors must equal to 0 in order for this to be true. So for an example, if I had 4 times x is equal to 0, right? What must x equal to? It has to equal to 0, right? In order for this to be a true statement. So it's called a zero product property. If you have a product of two things, so these are called factors here. If you have a product of two factors and equals to 0, one of them has to be equal to 0 in order to make this true. If I made this a little bit more complicated, what if I said 4 times x minus 2 is equal to 0? If I have 4 times x minus 2 is equal to 0, I know that x minus 2 better equal to 0 in order to make this true. So if x minus 2 has to equal to 0, x minus 2 has to equal to 0 in order to make this true. So therefore, x is equal to, so what you do is you add 2 to the other side, you isolate the 2, or the x, so you get x is equal to 2. So you can solve for x using the zero product property. All right, so let's take a look at these problems here. So here, using the zero product property, step 3, I have 3y and times y minus 7 is equal to 0. So they're factored. So that's why we factored it, because now they're the product of two things and equals to 0. So once it gets to that point, I can now use my ZPP. So ZPP says that the factors, one of the factors or both, has to equal to 0 in order to make this true. So therefore, this is a factor and this is a factor, right? Factors are things that are being multiplied with each other, and that's why we factored. So therefore, 3y must equal to 0. Well, if 3y must equal to 0, let's solve for y. How do you get y to sit by itself? You divide both sides by 3. So you divide both sides by 3, you get y must equal to 0. This one, if I use the zero product property, y minus 7 must equal to 0, right? So these factors must equal to 0. One or both of them has to equal to 0 in order to make that true. So y minus 7 is equal to 0. I add 7 on both sides, so y is equal to 7. So therefore, in this problem here, you have two answers. In linear equations, you only had one answer, but a quadratic equation, notice the highest exponent is 2. So when the highest exponent is 2, you have two answers. So the answer is y is equal to 0 and y is equal to 7. And again, like all problems, the last step is to check your work. So if you look at this here, what I'm going to put here is if a times b equals to 0, then a equals to 0 or b equals to 0. Set each factor equal to 0 and then solve for your variable. I'll fill this out later and then I'll post this up so you have the written form, but I'm just saying it to you guys in words. And then the last step here is to check by plugging in your answer into the original equation. So if I plug 0 into here, I get 0 minus 0 equals to 0. Ba-dam. If I plug 7 into here, 7 times 7 is 49. 49 times 3 is some number, minus 21 times 7, which is some number. If you subtract them, you will end up getting 0. I don't have my calculator on hand, but you could also check your work by plugging it in. All right, does anyone have any questions at this point? You can unmute yourself and ask me any questions, and then I'll go on to 23. Does that make sense? Angelica, did you have a question?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Okay. Anyone want to unmute themselves and ask anything? All good in the hood? All right, let me do number 23 now. I'm not sure what that sound is, so if you guys could mute yourself. So here I am going to, so I'm going to erase all this, so I get a space. And you know what, I realized as I'm doing this, like, I feel really tired of talking. So I think in the next conference Zoom session, I think what I'm going to do is change things up is I'll do a problem and then I'll have you guys do a problem and have you guys interact and show your work on the video, okay? So bear with me for this one. It's kind of, I don't believe in someone lecturing for so long because if I were you guys, I'd be falling asleep, right? So bear with me for this one session where I'm just learning how to use a video, and then in the future I'll have it more interactive so you guys can talk and share and whatnot. All right, so with number 23, I have this times this equals to 0. We had factored in. Now I'm going to use the ZPP. So using the ZPP, I'm going to set this equal to 0 and set this equal to 0. Right? So I set each factor equal to 0. And that's why it says here, set each factor to 0 and then solve for your variable. So I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. 4v minus 3 is equal to 0. V plus 1 is equal to 0. And now I can solve for it since now they look like linear equations. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. And then I'm going to divide by 4 on both sides. So I get v is equal to 3/4. So again, it could be a fraction. That's a-okay. Okay, and here I'm going to subtract 1 on both sides. So I get v equals to -1. And that's it, right? And again, you could check your work by plugging it in. And you should get